Hello friends, welcome back to my channel Mukesh English, and this is Mukesh Soni, your favorite YouTuber. Friends, in this video we shall have the discussion of an interesting story titled Open Window, written by H.H.Munro, the famous British novelist and the short story writer. H.H.Munro is known for his pen name called SAKI, and he's known for his stories where he brings a sense of humor, for which his stories are very much known, very much well known for the sense of humor. And in this story we are going to find out the impact of a prank. I hope you have gone across, you have experienced of any of the prank. Let us see that can we experience any prank in this story Open Window. So before that, let's know about the story. This story, it's a tale of misunderstanding. It's based on one of the misunderstandings. There's a nervous visitor. His name is Frampton Nuttall. He's seeking rest in the country. He meets a young niece who tells a story of a tragic hunting accident. So a tea turns to a terror. The truth unfolds in a very hilarious twist, leaving Frampton fleeing an imaginary danger. He starts thinking some kind of imaginary danger. So the story is all wrapped in a darkly comedic tale where truth and consequence become absurdly tangled. Means to say, it's like a dark comedy, which is for which H.H. Munro or Saki is well known. So we will find here a bit of humor as well as a kind of suspense. So this is a very brief outline of the story. I have not told the complete story in the introduction. Now let's try to understand the characters. Which are the characters in this story? So we have very first character named Frampton Nuttall. Frampton Nuttall is the main character. He's a nervous man, very much nervous person who has come here to seek rest, to get a cure for his nerves problem. Then another character we have here, Veera, a very self-possessed young girl of 15 years age, of 15, and she's a niece of Mrs. Sappleton, who tells Frampton the very fabricated story. So Vera, who is the niece of Mrs. Sappleton, and this Vera tells a very fabricated, a kind of tragic story to Frampton Nuttall. Now, who is Mrs. Sappleton? Obviously, we have seen here. She is Vera's aunt, who is mentioned in Vera's story, and later she appears. Afterwards, she appears in the story. Then Mrs. Sappleton's husband. Mrs. Sappleton's husband is also part of the fabricated tragedy. He's mentioned as having gone missing during a hunting trip, but later appears alive. Then we have another character, Mrs. Sappleton's two brothers. So these two brothers are also the part of the fabricated tragedy, and they have been portrayed as they have been lost in a bog. They have been lost in a bog, means to say a kind of a wet landscape, but they return at the end of the story. Then we have one more character here, the spaniel. The spaniel is a brown dog that was also lost with Mr. Sappleton and the two brothers of Mrs. Sappleton during the hunting trip, and they also return at the end of the story. So these are the characters we have here: Frampton Nuttall, Vera, Mrs. Sappleton, Mrs. Sappleton's husband, Mrs. Sappleton's two brothers, and the spaniel, the brown dog. So let's divide the story into the 6 scenes. So I have tried to divide the story in 6 scenes so that we can easily weave the whole threads of the story very easily. We can easily understand. Scene 1 is here inside the living room. So Frampton Nuttall, a man with a nervous disorder, he travels to the country to improve his health. He also carries the letters of introduction from his sister. Frampton would like to meet his sister, that is Mrs. Sappleton, and he visits her home. So he has to wait for Mrs. Sappleton because Mrs. Sappleton, and here, the moment he reaches Mrs. Sappleton's home, he's greeted by Vera. Vera, who is Mrs. Sappleton's niece, she greets Frampton. She's about 15 years old, and she tells him that Mrs. Appleton is getting ready. Please be seated. So Vera is very calm and very self-possessed girl, as she's engaging in very small talk with Frampton, who is visibly uncomfortable and nervous. So she starts having some discussion, but Frampton feels very uncomfortable. So he has come to the countryside on the advice of his doctor and sister to seek rest and peace. That was his purpose. Then in the scene two, the conversation begins. Which conversation? The conversation begins between Vera and Frampton. So Vera starts asking Frampton if he knows anyone in the area. Frampton admits that he knows very few people and only came because his sister, Mrs. Appleton, had stayed in the area years before and she gave him letters of introduction to meet people. So Vera then casually mentions that Frampton must know anything about her aunt's great tragedy. So we ask Frampton that, do you know about my aunt's tragedy here, the great tragedy here? So this scene is very crucial because this scene is going to plant the seed of doubt and curiosity in both the Frampton and readers. So Frampton starts suspecting which kind of great tragedy she is asking about. Even as a reader, we also feel that what kind of tragedy she's talking about, because Mrs. Appleton is getting ready, she's not here. So, what kind of story Vera is going to bring up here? So, in the scene three, we find here Vera tells a tragic story. Vera begins recounting the tragic story to Frampton. She starts telling a tragic story to Frampton. She tells that 3 years ago, her aunt's husband, Mr. Sappleton, and her two brothers, they went hunting through the French window. Sadly, they never returned. Unfortunately, they didn't return because they were swallowed by a bog on the moors. The bodies were never recovered, which has left Mrs. Appleton heartbroken. So here Vera has brought out a very tragic story to Frampton, saying that, look, before 3 years, my aunt Mrs. Appleton's husband and her two brothers, these three people, along with the spaniel, the white dog, brown dog, they went through the French window. They went to jungle through the French window for hunting. French window means to say a kind of window which has a door size window. Bog means a very wet landscape, right? So so she says that they went through this window and they got lost in a very wet landscape, in a very treacherous place, and their bodies also have never been recovered. And because of this, Mrs. Sappleton is very unhappy, very much dejected, very much disappointed. So she felt heartbroken. So this is how she has weaved a story here about Mrs. Appleton. So what happens later? Since that day, Mrs. Appleton leaves the window open, believing that her husband and brothers will come back one day. So Vera says that, Mr. Frampton, this is the reason that this window is always open, because Mrs. Appleton, she believes that one day her husband and her two brothers will return. So here in this scene three, Vera brings a very horrified picture, adding that her aunt expects these three persons to come back at any moment. At any moment. So this is how she has created a very tragic story. So in the scene four, what's going to happen here? Aunt arrives, right? Aunt arrives. The aunt who has been about the aunt, Vera told that she's not happy. She's very disappointed. Her husband and two brothers got lost in the jungle when they went for hunting. They got stuck in some treacherous landscape, right? So now the aunt has arrived. Let us see what happens. So Mrs. Appleton enters the room very cheerful, very energetic. She's not aware of the tragic story which Vera had just now told Frampton Nuttall. She apologized for being late and asked if Veera has been keeping Frampton entertained. She says that I hope Veera has not bored you. She might have engaged you in some sort of talk. Without missing a beat, Mrs. Sepleton casually mentions that her husband and brothers they will be back soon from their hunting trip, and they always enter the house through the open window, muddy boots and all. So she tells very casually that okay, my husband has gone, my husband and my two brothers they're gone for hunting, and they can enter the house anytime through the open window, and so that's the reason that the window is open. So here what happens, this scene creates a kind of contrast, because what Frampton expects based on Vera's tragic story, and here Mrs. Sepleton's behavior is very much normal, because he has received from the tragic story that she is not happy, she's very disappointed, and here Mrs. Sepleton is talking about her husband and her two brothers very casually, very much casually. So there's a kind of a bizarre here to Frampton, who believes that they are long dead, and this brings more tension because Frampton starts believes something supernatural might be happening. He starts thinking that something is wrong here, right? So let us see what happens. So scene 5, there is a return here. So as Mrs. Sapleton continues talking, Frampton notices that her attention keeps drifting toward the window, toward the open window. She's keep on observing the open window, and suddenly she brightens up and announces that her husband and brothers are coming home. She announces that, oh, I'm very, very happy that, look, my husband and my two brothers are coming. Frampton turns to look, and to his terror, and he sees three figures walking towards the house across a lawn, just as Veera described. And really, he observes that three persons are walking towards a house, towards a house across a lawn, the way Veera had described. So, who are these three persons? One is carrying a white coat over his shoulder, and a brown spaniel follows behind them, and the sight of these ghostly figures makes Frampton very panic, and he grabs his hat and stick, fleeing the house in terror. So the way he grabs his hat and stick as he's about to run away from the house in panic. So this is the climax. This is the climax of the story, where the tension has reached to the peak. So everything what Veera has described seems to come true, confirming Frampton's worst fear. So, from this perspective, he's witnessing the return of the dead people. So, from his perspective, he thinks that, my God, these three dead bodies, these three deadly figures are coming back to home. And he has grabbed his hat and stick so firmly as he's about to run away from this house in terror. So, but it doesn't happen like this. There's a twist in the story here. Now Frampton has run away. Mrs. Appleton is confused. Mrs. Appleton has confused. He has run away in terror. She's confused and she asks Vera, what has happened? As her husband and brothers enter, she mentions how strange it was that Frampton left so abruptly. So really, Mrs. Appleton's husband and her two brothers have entered house, and she tells them that, look, how Frampton has left the house so abruptly without telling anybody. So Vera, she remains calm, and she again fabricates another story to explain Frampton's behavior. Look at this girl, Vera. She's so talented, right? Another prank she's going to create here. So Veera, she tells one more story about whom? About Frampton's behavior. So far, she told about Mrs. Appleton's husband and her two brothers. Now she's going to fabricate story about Frampton's behavior. So what does she say here? She tells her aunt that Frampton had a terrible fear of dogs, and once he had to spend a night in the cemetery. I'm sorry, the spelling error, in the cemetery to escape from a pack of wild dogs. So symmetry. She tells her aunt that, look, Frampton had a very terrible fear of the dogs, and that's the reason that one day he had to stay. He had to spend the whole night in the cemetery to escape, to get protected from a pack of wild dogs, from a group of wild dogs. So this is the another story which she has fabricated here. So romance at short notice was her specialty. That was the special things about Vera. She used to get a romance by creating such kind of fabricated story. So in this scene, we find here Vera's ability to create stories uh, is revealed here, and we realize that her earlier tragic story was also a kind of fabrication, and the ending twist reveals Vera's mischievous nature and the true humor of the story. And this is how the story Open Window reveals here. I'm sorry, this is how the story Open Window ends here. So what do we find here? To conclude, we can say that through these scenes, the story Open Window cleverly combines humor, suspense, and a surprising twist. Vera's ability to manipulate the situation through storytelling drives the plot, while Frampton's gullibility, he gets gullied very soon, gullibility and fragile nerves, making perfect victim, because he's already, his nervous is breakdown, and he is so nervous. That's the reason that for to get cure he has come to the town. Thus, the story explores the power of suggestion, how easily people can be fooled, and how appearances can be deceiving. That is a conclusion of the story here. So when we go through the story, we find few themes here. The first theme we find here, deception. Vera tricks Frampton with a made up story, fabricated story, showing how it is easy to fool someone with a believable lie. Next, imagination. Frampton's mind exaggerates what he hears, making him think he's seeing ghosts because of his anxiety. Then mental fragility. Frampton's weak nerves making easy to scare, showing how vulnerable people can be when they are already stressed. Then the next theme we have here, reality versus perception. The story shows how what we believe can change how we see the things, because Frampton thinks the normal situation is something scary. Then social anxiety. Frampton feels awkward and uncomfortable around people, which makes him more likely to believe Vera's story, and he gets panicked. Just a minute. Just a minute. So this is how I have tried to, okay, we have one more theme. I'm sorry, we have one more theme is here, women's roles. Women's roles. So Vera, this young girl who takes control of the situation, showing that she's clever and in charge, even though Frampton is the adult. So these are the few themes which I have tried to gather from the story Open Window. So friends, this is how I have tried to so friends, this is how I have tried to summarize, analyze the story, and I have tried to divide the story into the 6 scenes, so it will be very easy for you to understand. And hope you like this video. If you like the video, write in the comment box, click on the like button, share this video to your friends, to your classmate. And if you have not yet subscribed my channel, please do subscribe. A lot of videos are about to appear on my channel as far as your syllabus is concerned, question answers, summary, model question paper discussion. So stay connected with Mukesh English. Thank you so much for watching this video. Thanks a lot.